Thank you for that lovely introduction. Is there something better to hold my drinks? That is one of the tough parts of the job is where does my drink go? So, what an honor to be here. Thank you all so much for coming and supporting the library. Please support your bookstore. Thank you to Caval for having me. As mentioned, I'm from Louisville. I write about booze for a living, and I drink it all the time, and I score it, and write about it and talk about it. So all I do is drink and talk about it. So, and inevitably, people ask me, how the hell did you get that job? And a few weeks ago, the New York Times did a story on me and some other whiskey writers talking about how this is the golden age of American whiskey writing. And what's funny about that is half the people commenting is like, well, those are just functioning alcoholics. The other half was in the comment section was like, oh my God, I want that job. So this is how I became a whiskey writer. After a tour in Iraq in 2000, that ended in 2005 for me, I moved to Louisville, and the only job I could get was as a food editor. Now at this point, what was fancy to me was balsamic vinaigrette. Red Lobster was where you went on really special occasions. And the Olive Garden was pretty fancy in itself. And I'm not gonna lie, Chick-fil-A was high class for me back then. Nice. Thank you so much, sir. And if you guys happen to see the whiskey glass go empty, please feel free to fill it up. Thank you. So this was a point in my career where I didn't really have a lot of options. So when this food magazine company offered me a position, I took it. And when you write about food, and I fell in love with food, you eventually write about alcohol. Well, living in Kentucky, I started writing about something that I was very passionate about, something that I had been consuming long before the legal age, and that was bourbon. My first legal age drink of bourbon was on the Delta Chi Fraternity House in Oklahoma State, and I believe it was Jim Beam White Label. There may or may not have been a glass associated with that first consumption, but now I'm much more responsible with how I consume my beverages. But so when I took that position, I wrote my very first story on bourbon in 2006. And as soon as I wrote a story, I looked around and I was like, no one else is writing about this. And so I decided to basically dedicate as much as I could to writing about bourbon. And around 2008 to 2010, I said, I want to write a bourbon book. This is after I had written Camera Boy. And I said, I want to write a bourbon book. And I was told there was no market for it. They said, you cannot write a bourbon book because no one will read it. And to the agent and the publisher's perspective, they were right. There were not a lot of bourbon books on the shelves as there are today. So I came back and I said, well, I've got this other idea. I'm seeing a trend of women rise up through the ranks of these distilling companies and take on roles that people didn't think women could take on in this male-dominated industry. What about a book on women and whiskey? And they're like, well, okay, we'll see if that works. I got about 45 to 70 rejection letters on that book. One offer. And it was from a little old publisher in Virginia that specialized in social histories called Potomac. And it's remained their best-selling book since 2013. After that book, which won me, when I die and you get that little byline in your obit, I think I'll probably be known for Whiskey Women, because since that book, before that book, there were no female master distillers in Kentucky. Now we have 3. Women are not only the master distillers, they're the bosses, they're running the companies. In many respects, women have always been in that role, but they just haven't gotten a lot of credit. And so that's what that book is about. And I'm very proud of it, very, very proud of that title. So after that book, I went to my agent, I said, I really, really want to write a bourbon history. Once again, I was told there was no market for it. No market for it. And to their credit, it wasn't that much of a market. They're starting to show a little bit of interest in people reading about bourbon, not just drinking it. And they said, what about a tasting guide? I said, I don't really want to write a tasting guide because tasting guides tend to be fluffy and, very brand-oriented. And if you read my work, I call out a lot of bullshit in my writing. And if you read a whiskey label, there's a lot of bullshit in whiskey. And so I told them, I said, if I'm going to do this, I'm going to do it my way. And we're going to call out all the BS that's going on in whiskey. And we're going to disclose things like their recipes and their production information, sometimes with their permission, sometimes without their permission. But that's what we're going to do. And so that's what Bourbon Curious became. And so that was published in 2015. And finally, after what's almost been a decade of research on this book, I finally got to write a bourbon history. So this is my Bourbon, the Rise, Fall, and Rebirth of an American Whiskey is probably, it's the favorite, it's the most enjoyable book I've written because of the amount of new material that's in there. So, and that's what I'm here to talk about today. Before we get any further, it's very important I explain to you what bourbon is. Bourbon is a whiskey. So everyone always asks the question, what's the difference between bourbon and whiskey? Well, whiskey is a categorical term that essentially means distilled grain aged in wood. Scotch is a type of whiskey. Canadian whiskey is a type of whiskey. Irish whiskey. There's even Mexico whiskey. There's Brazilian whiskey. There's Argentinian whiskey. So there's whiskey all over the world. In Vietnam, they make a whiskey and they put a snake in the bottle. I would not recommend drinking that. But if you Google it, you'll see a cobra in a bottle of rice whiskey. Yeah, they drink that. So what is bourbon? To be bourbon, it has to be at least 51% corn, a fermented mash of at least 51% corn. It has to be distilled at no higher than 160 proof. And the reason why that's important is vodka is coming off the still at 190 proof. Any vodka fans in the house? Okay, the door is right back there. Thank you for coming. I kid. In a minute, you'll find out why vodka is bourbon's arch nemesis. Very, very, very true story. So then it's going into the barrel, a new charred oak barrel, whereas the regulation would call it new charred oak container at no more than 125 proof. And the barrel is what really separates bourbon from the other categories. In addition to the corn, bourbon has that new charred oak barrel really is what amplifies the flavors. When it goes into the barrel, it's as clear as the water from your tap. So it's like putting in what would look like tap water. And in a few years, it's dark, russet. And that's because the barrel is chemically changing it. And you smell caramel in bourbon, you smell vanilla. That's because the wood sugars and the whiskey are combining, and when it comes out, it's bourbon, and it has that beautiful caramel, butterscotch, and vanilla, nutmeg, cinnamon, all those wonderful flavors, and it's because of the barrel. Scotch goes into used barrels. Most of the time, used bourbon barrels. Canadian whiskey as well, Irish whiskey. So American standards lean heavily on the barrel, whereas other countries, they do lean on the barrel. They just have more rotations of the different types of barrels. And then it has to be, it can't be bottled any lower than 80 proof, with the exception of New Zealand and Australia. When they were negotiating with us for their free trade agreements, they demanded that they have bourbon that is at 74 proof. I have no idea why, but so Australia and New Zealand are the only two countries in the world where you can get legitimate bourbon bottled below 80 proof. And bourbon just has to be made in the United States. In 1964, Congress got together, they had nothing else to do at the time, they got together and declared bourbon to be a unique product the United States. So bourbon is the only liquid in our country that has congressional protection. So it is possible that Congress can get some things right. But there was one guy who was against bourbon becoming a unique product in the United States. Representative James Lindsay from New York. He did not want bourbon to become a unique product in the United States because he had interest in Mexico with a Mexican distillery. Now that Mexican bourbon was just awful. If you find it at an estate sale, buy it for the historic value. But whatever you do, for the love of God, do not open it and taste it. That stuff it tastes like perfume, and really rancid, really not good. So bourbon, that's the legality of bourbon. Bourbon can be made anywhere in the United States, not just Kentucky. As you taste it, some Illinois bourbon back there. But Kentucky is the birthplace and where all the notoriety, where all the legends come from. And I talked about like how I spend a lot of my time kind of downplaying those legends and bringing out some of the truth. Well, one of those is about a Baptist minister who allegedly invented bourbon in 1789. As the legend goes, his barn catches on fire, and he has his barrels inside the barn. The outside of the barrels, nothing happens to the barrels. Nothing happens on the outside, but on the inside, they get charred. Now, I'm no physicist or scientist of any kind, but I'm pretty sure that it's impossible for wood to burn on the inside and not the outside. But I figured it out. I know what happened. He was a Baptist minister. It was the great Immaculate Charception. So that legend comes about in the late 50s and 60s when the bourbon distillers were actually trying to gain the Declaration of Independence, or the Declaration of a Unique Product of the United States. And they wanted it to pass on April 30th, 1964, which would have been the 175th anniversary of George Washington becoming our president, swearing in to be. The only way they could have made bourbon sound more American is if Elijah Craig time traveled forward to kill KGB operatives. They really worked hard to ingrain bourbon to be a unique product of the United States. And today, bourbon is an $8.5 billion economic engine for the Commonwealth of Kentucky. 60% of every single bottle of bourbon that you buy in Kentucky, and largely out here as well, goes to build roads and schools in Kentucky. So bourbon actually helps the children. Remember that. There are more barrels of bourbon in Kentucky than there are people. That's how important it is to this state. And it really begins when we are created as a country. We start migrating west, and for several reasons. Religious reasons, the Catholics and the Baptists wanted their religions to take hold, and so they were encouraged to move west. In fact, one of the most famous Catholics of that time was a guy named Basil Hayden. Basil Hayden has a distinction of having two brands named after him. Old Granddad is named after Basil Hayden, and of course, Basil Hayden. Another migration was Virginia. Virginia, which owned Kentucky at the time, said if you move west into Kentucky, as they called it then, and plant some corn and build a cabin, you can have that land. And then one of the more story tells of why people moved west was the Whiskey Rebellion. After we had won the Revolutionary War, we had to pay for it. And one of the first things we did was tax the distillers. Many of these distillers had fought during the Revolution and were not too keen on paying taxes. So naturally, they tarred and feathered the tax collectors and took arms up against the new government. In return, George Washington federalized 12,500 troops, to settle them. So the first time that we have troops federalized against our own civilians is because over whiskey and paying taxes. But a lot of people moved west to Kentucky from Maryland, from Pennsylvania, New York, the eastern whiskey states. And they moved west because it was harder to find them there. There were excise tax collectors there as well, don't get me wrong. But they show up and try to collect taxes. They don't come home for dinner that night, kind of thing. So Kentucky was a little bit more raw and rugged than Pennsylvania, and so they could get away with a little bit more. So when President Thomas Jefferson repealed the whiskey tax in 1802, the people who were for the whiskey tax said that Jefferson was placating to the rich. In some respects, distillers were the original one-percenters. They were thought to be wealthy, and the tea importers and the coffee importers were not very happy with the distillers not having to pay taxes. So basically, the taxation comes back for a very short period to pay for the War of 1812, and then from 1817 to the Civil War, distillers do not have to pay federal taxes. What happens when an industry does not have to pay any type of tax? It grows. The distilling business grew exponentially in between 1817 and 1861. Even right here, in this region, there were probably about 5 to 10 distillers, just in this block. In fact, knowing Glen Ellyn and the history of you guys drinking, it's probably a lot more than that. Seriously. I did a little homework on you all, and you all had some bootleggers back in the third Prohibition. Like to drink, huh? So you had whiskey distillers in Illinois, Missouri, Wisconsin, Kentucky, Tennessee. They were all over the country. But of course, the Civil War returned. We have a Civil War, and what happens when you have war? You institute a tax again. What's interesting, the Confederates actually had a prohibition on during their time. They didn't allow whiskey distilling. They confiscated the stills and used the copper and the metals for bullets and such. Whereas the North actually just taxed, and so they had greater pools of revenue than the Confederates. And I've always wondered, what would have happened if the Confederates would have, played up their hairs a little bit more. One, they probably would have had a lot more drunk soldiers, but on the other hand, they probably would have had more money. At any rate, so whiskey distilling taxation comes back during the Civil War, and after the Civil War, there are a lot of what they call whiskey rings forming all over the country. So if you're a business who hasn't been paying taxes for all these years, what do? You try to avoid paying taxes. And of course, you bribe officials. And when there's more heat coming down on you, you keep bribing up further, and the higher you go. So President Grant's re-election campaign, several distillers actually about 200 distillers from all over the country decided to pay for his re-election campaign. They defrauded the U.S. government of some $3 million in the 1870s to pay for President Grant's re-election campaign. And one of the men behind it was Orville Babcock, one of Grant's closest friends. And Grant had to come in and testify on his behalf, making him the first president to testify in a criminal proceeding. But the taxes kept coming, and when the whiskey rings were laid out, the people who were caught were in Missouri, Wisconsin, and right here in Illinois, as well as Indiana. And Kentucky was left largely alone. And those states that had been caught defrauding the government, they actually ended up becoming brewer areas. They were initially distillation areas, but places like St. Louis became a brewery town. Milwaukee became a brewery town. Chicago became a brewery town. But if they did not get caught, they may still be some of the prominent whiskey distillation areas. So after we see the end of taxes and the return of taxes, we start seeing a battle for quality. There was a type of whiskey out there called rectified whiskey. Rectified whiskey is when someone purchases a barrel of whiskey from a distiller and then adds something like tobacco spit, prune juice, water, kind of like your cocaine dealer on the corner. He's going to, if he wants to make more money, he's going to put in baking soda. I'm kidding about cocaine dealers here. I don't know anything about your cocaine supply. But I am told that the cocaine dealers in the not so good areas will sometimes add baking soda and thus cut it. Got that off of an SVU episode once. Yeah. So the distillers, these rectifiers, would cut the whiskey with all these really unsavory liquids. And so the doctors who were prescribing medicinal whiskey were not getting 100% whiskey. They would actually get about 25% by volume of actual alcohol. So their patients were getting not recovering. And the people who wanted to kick back in a bar weren't getting intoxicated quick enough. So the rectified whiskey was a real problem. But there was nothing on the books to help people from ensuring that they got proper whiskey. So the distillers started fighting for what we called the Bottle and Bond Act of 1897. To this day, you'll see it on the bottle. Up until 1897, distillers really did not bottle their own products. They sold the barrels to wholesalers who then bottled it. Sometimes they added prune juice and other things to it, and sometimes they bottled it straight, or pure as they called it. And there was this big fight in Washington over the Bottle and Bond Act. You had the Canadian whiskey distillers who had started to come in saying like, oh, you're just trying to cut away our ability to sell here in the United States. And then you had the rectified guys saying, you're just trying to take away the jobs from the wholesalers. And the distillers saying like, no, we just want control of our product. So for the first time in whiskey history in 1897, they actually had a federal protection act just for them, so they could bottle their own stuff, and it had to be 4 years old from one distillery season, and bottled at 100 proof. And that gave the physicians the medicinal integrity that they believed they needed to prescribe it. And oh, by the way, in the 1800s, if you were sick, you drank whiskey. If you were pregnant, about to have a baby, you drank whiskey. If your baby was born and it had jaundice, it drank whiskey. So it was the only medicine of the day. So, in fact, there was a whiskey company called Duffy's Pure Malt Whiskey. It was rather renowned for its medicinal claims. It claimed to cure cancer. It claimed to cure ugliness. And it had testimonies from women who lived to be 162 years old. Now, the federal government did not appreciate this. The American Medical Association boycotted any journal that took their advertisements, including the New England Journal of Medicine, which was accepting advertisements from Duffy's Pure Malt. And so the government convened and created an act called the Pure Food and Drug Act. And that was basically to protect consumers from medicinal claims that were false. So that took care of our snake oil salesmen, it took care of bad vaccines, and it took care of Duffy's Pure Malt telling people that it was, you could live to be 162 years old. So it cleaned up a lot of problems in our country. So our very first two consumer protection legislation acts in our country's history are closely related to people wanting to have pure whiskey. So, medicinal purposes, remember that, for medicinal purposes. But the one flaw in all of these definitions was that there was no actual definition of bourbon, and whiskey was still kind of out there. There was not a lot of material of what whiskey was. You could still put in 25% bourbon and grain neutral spirit, and someone could call it bourbon. There was nothing on the books to define it. And so people would do that, and the distillers and the government would sue those distillers, or the rectifiers, or the wholesalers. It was clogging up the court system. So when President Taft took office, he spent his first 7 months defining whiskey. He studied the history, he studied the production efforts, he studied everything. And he defined whiskeys, bourbons, and he gave American whiskey its first true class and identities and definitions. So if anyone ever asked you who the greatest whiskey president was in history, it was President Taft. Probably the only thing he's going to go down known for in a positive sense. Of course, shortly after President Taft does this, we start seeing Prohibition. And when Prohibition hits, this area knows quite well what bootleggers did and how they were able to make a living after Prohibition. Prohibition made a lot of people rich. Prior to Prohibition, the distillers were selling their whiskey in bulk to other countries, to the Bahamas, to Bermuda, to Cuba. And why do you think that was? So the rum runners could bring it back in and sell it here in the States. Most of the bourbon distillers were actually trying to make a deal with Cuba, where that they could basically rent space in warehouses, and the Cubans wanted $12.50 per barrel. To give you an idea of how outrageous that was, today their contract aging contracts are $5 per barrel in a Kentucky warehouse. So that was outrageous for 1919. And they said no. And so they were stuck with all of this whiskey while the Maryland and the Pennsylvania distillers had successfully sold it to the islands and other countries. And so they had to fight for medicinal whiskey. And they were somewhat fortunate that their arguments were coming on the heels of the Spanish influenza, which killed hundreds of thousands throughout the world. Whiskey was the best treatment, according to many physicians. And this was before Tylenol, before penicillin, before all these wonderful drugs that we have, really even in the 40s. And so the doctors, the druggists, and the distillers went to Congress and said, we have to have medicinal whiskey. And so they put medicinal whiskey on the books, but there was not really any kind of method for how it would go down. No one knew what medicinal whiskey would look like and how it would be sold. So on the first day of Prohibition, you had distillers getting arrested because they were trying to move barrels in their warehouse. You had distillers getting robbed. I mean, there's all kinds of stories of whiskey getting taken by the revenue agents, and really the revenue agents were picking on the mainstream distillers while letting the bootleggers go free. And what they were doing is the revenue agents were not always the most, they were often corrupt. I know it's going to shock a lot of people, but you wave a $20 bill in front of a guy whose family is poor, he's going to take it. And so he would do things, he would take the orders of bootleggers, and the bootleggers' competition was legitimate medicinal whiskey. So the bootleggers were trying to sell to the doctors, and they were also stealing from the legitimate whiskey suppliers. So Prohibition for the legitimate distillers is a kind of up and down time, season. And one of my other books on Whiskey Women, you learn about how women were actually better bootleggers than men. Women outnumbered men bootleggers 5-1, and the reason why is because it was uncouth to search for male officers to search women, and the rise of the female bootlegger led to women officers. So there was a national recruiting spree for female cops, And women do not trust other women. This was a shock to me in my research. And the things that these female cops said about their other ladies, I was stunned to see a woman say such a bad thing about other women like that. It was shocking. So Prohibition ends in 33, and actually people could start selling again in 34. And there is this massive amount of investment going into whiskey. And this is at a time of the Great Depression. So whiskey distilling was one of the only places you could get a job. And which way is Peoria? That way? That way. So, that way? Peoria, Illinois had the largest distillery in the country after Prohibition. And they had hundreds of workers. And people could not wait to start working there and then later go on strike. But they had distilleries all over Peoria. They had distillers all over Maryland, Pennsylvania, not New York. New York still was very temperance-minded. And they had a $1,000 licensing fee if you wanted to open a distillery. Well, that was a lot of money then, and you didn't, no one applied for a license. So the states that wanted distilling to take place, they created laws that were special and would allow businesses to take advantage of the country's desire to have a drink. And so there was all this money coming in, and whiskey was like one of the best investments you could make as a banker. And then Germany invades Poland, and everything goes to shit. The U.S. government did not allow American whiskey distillers to make whiskey. They needed the grains. And more importantly, they needed industrial alcohol. They needed industrial alcohol to make grenades, to make gunpowder, parachutes, all the things that you need industrial alcohol to do. And so the large plants converted their stills to make industrial alcohol, ethanol essentially. And they contributed to the war effort. They weren't able to make whiskey. So from 1942 to 1945, the only whiskey that was in the stores was when it was distilled prior. And there's talks of a whiskey shortage today. I'm guilty of talking about that in some of my writing, which I do believe there's a shortage of the brands you want, but it's largely because the brands are opening up new markets. Anyway, I digress. But there was a real whiskey shortage then. And people were going to the liquor store like, why can't I get Old Taylor, Bottle of Bond? Why can't I get this anymore? You're like, well, it's because we can't get it. And so the distillers were doing price fixing. They were holding these stocks, and then they were working together to fix the prices. And the Department of Justice didn't appreciate that very much. They were called into several hearings during the time and accused of price fixing and then later monopoly, running monopolies. And it was a little bit of a look of like what the bootleggers looked like as legitimate businessmen. They were still operating in many respects like that. In fact, in Kansas City, there were several people who worked in the distributor business who were murdered just to get a whiskey account. So they still operated in some respects as the mobsters they were during Prohibition, or some of them, not all of them. But so they made industrial alcohol during World War II. After World War II, we go into the Korean War again. Or we go into the Korean War shortly thereafter. And the distillers are scared that they're going to have to make industrial alcohol for the Korean War effort. And they started holding back their stocks again. And again, they get brought into the Department of Justice for price fixing and for monopoly practices. And they also start buying up all the little guys. From 1939 to like 1954, the majority of the independent distillers who had all of this excitement about coming out of Prohibition, they had to sell because they couldn't afford to convert their stills the old ways. They couldn't convert their stills to industrial alcohol production. And today, we're only just now getting back to where we have more than just a handful of distillers concentrated in Kentucky, Indiana, and Tennessee. Now we have more than 1,500 distillers across the country. A lot of them are small-scale independent guys like Whiskey Acres over here. Raise your hand. Like Cabal back there. Just now getting back after all these years after Prohibition. A lot of it was market dynamics, but most of it was legal. To open a distillery is very difficult, and there are a lot of laws on the books still from 1934 in a lot of counties, and it's a very difficult business to be in. But the 1950s was a time where the big companies were becoming bigger. They were buying up the little guys, they were becoming conglomerates, and they also started doing things like diversifying. They brought in something called a grain-neutral spirit, is what it was on the books, but in Russia, it was called vodka. I need a drink. If I'm going to start talking about vodka, my blood pressure gets up. Again, who likes vodka here? Good. All right. Oh, that door's over there. I kid. Vodka's fantastic. I kid. So these distillers, they were large publicly traded companies. They had interest in medicine. Some of them had publishing companies. They were just very diversified, and the beverage alcohol business was just a part of it. And they started bringing in things like tequilas and rums and vodkas. And then James Bond said he wanted a martini shaken, but not stirred. And that led to the movement of white spirits. So people started drinking vodka, and no one knew why. I mean, it was a real country epidemic in the early 1960s. I mean, you had people wanting to call out ambassadors for treason for drinking Russian vodka. It was a serious thing if you were between 40 and 70 in the 1960s, vodka was the enemy. I mean, it didn't even have a federal definition until 1959, so it was not a appreciated product. But the youth, the people who watched James Bond and did young people things on the beach and such, they really loved vodka, and vodka took off. And the bourbon distillers started seeing their lost revenues year after year after year, and they didn't know how to compete. So at first they said, well, just mix it with orange juice like you do vodka. That didn't work. Then they said, well, hey, mix it with cranberry juice like you do vodka. That didn't work. And so they started doing these advertisements with celebrities and bringing in women models, and that didn't work. So they're like, all right, we can't beat vodka. We're losing money, 10% a year. We have to age our product. They don't. Let's come up with a new category. So they came up with a category called light whiskey. Now, it's not like Bud Light where it's less calories. It's a category where it comes off distilled at a higher proof and it goes into a used barrel. And so basically, it's a little bit more neutral and not as, you don't get those rich caramel notes that you do in bourbon. And they thought that it was going to be a home run, slam dunk home run, and they would be able to compete with vodka on vodka's turf, orange juice and such. That didn't work. They actually lost a lot of money. And at this point, the distillers were like, screw it, we're done. And in 1972, you had Stitzel-Weller sell to a conglomerate. You had Old Tailor close. You would have the Willett family have to change their efforts and later shut down. And you had all of these brands just kind of go away. But there were brands who never gave up, who never stopped believing in the bourbon dream of Elijah Craig and the Immaculate Charception, They never stopped. One of those brands was Maker's Mark. Maker's Mark just kept being Maker's Mark. Red dripping wax, wheated bourbon, blah, blah, blah. Then you had Jim Beam. Jim Beam because Booker No. Booker No was this big, burly guy who was an old school Kentucky distiller. I'd never met him. He passed away before I got into business, but you'll see a lot of his, you'll see a lot of videos of him out there on YouTube. I highly recommend you Google him. But he would not let Jim Beam go off on the vodka. And I was like, no, we're not vodka. That's not good. Let's stay with bourbon. Not only did they stay with bourbon, they decided to make fun of vodka. And in their advertisements, they would make fun of Russian vodka, and Smirnoff specifically. And it worked. They became the #1 selling bourbon in 1969 and never looked back. To this day, they're the #1 selling bourbon. Wild Turkey, another brand that didn't give up and stayed with the bourbon course. Evan Williams, another brand that didn't give up. And Ancient Age, another brand that didn't give up, but later on their parent company would give up on Ancient Age. But there's a lot of kind of like business stories there, and it's like if you stay true to what you are, you'll do well. But bourbon distillers tried to play in someone else's turf, and it hurt them immensely. By the late 70s, early 80s, bourbon's left for dead. No one's drinking bourbon. It was like number 5 next to cream liqueurs. Who the hell's drinking cream liqueurs right now? Maybe Kahlua, when you're hanging out with grandma. But it wasn't a category that anybody liked. It was no longer in the pop culture. Gone were the days of Paul Newman drinking 8-year-old bourbon on the Hustler. Now everything was vodka, tequila, and rum, and liqueurs, and gin, and nobody wanted bourbon. And so bourbon was just done. It was just kind of this old, tired category in the 80s. And then a guy named Elmer T. Lee says, why don't we do this thing called a single barrel, where we take an actual barrel and we bottle it for the commercial market. And their company strategized, and they did that, but their focus was not on the United States, it was in Japan. Japan was this real interesting market for bourbon distillers. The Japanese have always loved bourbon, dating back to the 1800s, in which they sued a distiller and won for mislabeling a barrel of bourbon, calling it straight when it actually was rectified whiskey. Remember what I said rectified whiskey was? All kinds of nasty stuff. The Japanese wanted the pure whiskey, and so the Japanese are very, very instrumental in American whiskey history. But they were the only market of interest for distillers in the early 80s. And so they started creating products for them, just for those markets. And the sales would grow 30% a year, 40% a year. And then Australia suddenly starts consuming a lot of bourbon. And so you have Australia and Japan that is showing, thank you so much. What do we have here?
We did it. You said.
Is it flavored vodka?
I was just following directions. You said when my glass is empty, someone refill it. And so.
Metal. Do we have a metal? It's very nice, by the way. So, the early 1980s they had a little glimmer of hope in Japan. And the sales were doing so well that it encouraged Kevin Hill to create to focus on Japan. They created a company called United Distillers to focus on Japan. Same with Jim Beam. Jim Beam came out with a type of product called small batch. It was something that had been done and used before, but they took it and kind of put a lot of marketing dollars into it and branded it very strongly. And so the 80s was a time of capturing Japan, and it was incredible growth. But then in '92, the Japanese economy collapsed, and we started getting into a little bit of a trade war with them. And everybody started pulling back. And that was not good. The United Distillers decided to close and sell off all of their brands, and it looked like bourbon was back to being bleak. But something happened. There was just enough life that all that good whiskey was hitting the domestic market. And a little thing called the internet was born. And as soon as the internet was born, I swear to God, one of the first things that happened was someone in Alaska talked to someone in Guatemala about their favorite bourbons. People got on bourbon, or got on the internet and started talking about bourbon. Go to places like bourbonenthusiast.net, straightbourbon.com. And you had, before Facebook and Reddit and Twitter and all these other social media sites, people were on these forums just talking about bourbon. I remember those days. Those were pretty cool. I was not a drinking age, so maybe I shouldn't have been reading those sites. But the enthusiasm was there. And the Kentucky Bourbon Festival comes out. The Kentucky Bourbon Trail comes out. And there's just enough life in these distilleries to encourage more growth. And all the while, there's this guy named Julian Van Winkle who's taking his grandpappy's name, Pappy, and selling the whiskey from his family's old distillery. Pappy Van Winkle becomes glorified, as the first American whiskey to get a perfect rating. Everyone's seeking it all the time. And this was before the long lines and the lotteries that we have today. But everybody wanted a bottle. And there were other bottles like that. There's a brand called Jefferson's that came out that was similar. Woodford Reserve comes out in '96. And so there's all of this life hitting bourbon. And in the 2000s, it's poised to do well. And you have all these limited edition products coming out. People are drinking it. And people today, especially the millennials, they do not want to taste something just because someone tells them to. They want taste. And that's why vodka has started to lose market share to whiskeys. By the way, the definition of vodka is odorless and tasteless. That's not my definition, that's the US government's. Just saying. So in the 2000s, bourbon is back. There's one specific year that I tracked where I believe that it was officially back, and that was 2008. And that was the year that the everyday mainstay products were selling in the double digits year after year. Prior to that, it was mostly just the limited edition whiskeys. But starting in like 2008, Jim Beam White Label was getting hard to find. You couldn't find Maker's Mark. Maker's Mark is, all of these are fairly mass produced, but they're still small scale when compared to like Jack Daniels. But you couldn't find Maker's Mark in a lot of markets. And so in reaction to that, what did makers do? They tried to lower their proof. They lowered their proof from 90 to 84, and they ended up on Jay Leno getting made fun of. They were on the front page of the Wall Street Journal. They were in the Wall Street Journal, I don't think it was the front page, but they were getting called out constantly by their consumers because Maker's Mark once said, "We'll never change the whiskey." And so they learned a lesson, allegedly, and they reversed it back to the old proof a few days later. Now, I don't know if that was a marketing ploy just to get some free publicity. They say it's not, and it's a very hurtful thing for them to even think about and talk about, but it was kind of a sign of where American whiskey was, and it's a part of Americana, in that whiskey helped build this country in many respects. It helped definitely build Kentucky. And now here we are in a room where some of you all may read my word, but most of you probably wanted to come and get some whiskey and learn a little bit. But here we are in a library talking about American whiskey. It's back. It is back in a big way. And it's probably going to go away if a few things happen. Here's some things to watch out for. And if you get a chance, bitch about it somewhere on social media or somewhere. We need more people complaining in today's society. So, I mean, I woke up this morning and I just thought to myself, there's just not enough people protesting right now. So if you can protest toward whiskey good, that'd be great. Here's what to look for. Age statements. Once upon a time, the age statement was the standard on whiskey. But because whiskey's become so popular again, they're taking off the age statement. Now, when you see an age on there, that means that it has the youngest barrel is the age on there. So if you have 5 barrels and 4 of them are 20-year-old, but only 1 is 6, then the age has to be 6 on there. So you cannot combine and have an average of the age. It has to be the youngest barrel in the batch. To make sure that they're meeting their brand's demand, they're taking the age statements off because they're no longer beholden to those ages. So the age statements are going away. They say that the taste quality, it doesn't change. Remember I said American whiskey has a lot of bullshit going for it? I think we might be getting a little bit of that spinning going on there. Flavored whiskey. Flavored whiskey is a category all unto itself. Things like Fireball, Jim Beam, maple, honey, cherry, cotton candy. There's all these different types of flavors. And that's taking away whiskey that can be used for a straight bourbon. Now that market has kind of fizzled out a little bit, and it's mostly for the frat kids doing their thing in college, and that's kind of where they're positioning themselves a little bit more. But their argument is it helps pay the bills for other things, and that's one where, okay, whatever. But flavored whiskey, in my estimation, is bad because it teaches people that you need flavoring for whiskey, but you don't. Whiskey's flavor is from the distiller's hands, the grains, the distillation, the fermentation. I get them backwards, by the way. The fermentation, distillation, and then the aging. So whiskey is beautiful all in itself. Two other things which the brands and us, we have no control over. A lot of the growth that we have had for whiskey has been from exports. Trade, if we have any kind of trade war, any kind of trade barriers, any kind of trade negative aspects toward trade, that will hurt American whiskey in a big way. In 2002, American whiskey had 200 million in exports. In 2013, it had 1.5 billion. So, and that's because our government had been negotiating trade deals that were very beneficial to American whiskey. Remember, when someone does a trade agreement with us, they have to agree to our terms of what bourbon is and what Tennessee whiskey is. But it's actually something that will hold up a negotiation if somebody does not want to adhere to our rules. And war. Every time we have a war, American whiskey goes down. But most importantly, the positives outweigh the negatives. We can't control the trade or the wars. We can't control that. And the most positive thing we have going in American whiskey right now is in this room, and that's these small independent distillers who are starting to make good product. 10 years ago, it was very difficult to taste some independent distiller or craft distiller whiskey. Now, they're getting there. There's some that's actually of age of like 4 to 6 years old and is neck and neck with stuff from Kentucky. So, if you want American whiskey to develop true terroir, like you have in Napa Valley with wine, or like you have in cognac with brandy, then we have to support the little guys, but support the ones you like. Don't buy bourbon you don't like. That's bad, because that sends the wrong message. So get what you like, but find a little guy to support, and that's very, very important to me, especially. But American whiskey's back largely because of you, the consumer. I'm able to write about bourbon for my living. I mean, this was not in the curriculum at Oklahoma State. It wasn't with my guidance counselor in Jones, Oklahoma, where I grew up. So this job is not anywhere. It's just, I kind of found it. because people love to drink. So, I just want to say cheers to you guys, American whiskey.